Hello, and welcome to Paul's Thorn, a podcast that explores disability in the Bible, its stories, meanings, and impact on faith, with the goal of examining how Scripture portrays disability, challenge common interpretations, and offer fresh theological insights. My name is Angela Vincent, and thank you for joining me today. So this is episode 10, the Book of Job from a Disability Lens. So in the 2 weeks since I've last recorded this podcast, I guess things have been going pretty uneventful, though last week turned into a bit of a unexpected challenge. I'm going to be traveling in a few weeks, and I live in a state that has not until this point required real ID. And so in order to prepare for that travel, and figuring that 5 weeks was enough time in which to do it, I looked into, last Sunday, setting up an appointment finally to get a real ID. This is for me and my husband. And I was sorely disabused of the notion this was going to be easy when I checked into the appointment log and realized that unless I was willing to travel about 100 miles round trip, that the only time I could get an appointment was going to be early November, which was after I intended to travel. So what that meant is that we had to take whatever appointments we could get. He ended up taking one on Whidbey Island, which is an island over, and I had to take one in West Seattle, which is very far south from where we actually live. So then those appointments created the challenges in and of themselves. From a transportation standpoint, how to get there, in that we tend to have older cars. And I wasn't quite prepared to go into Seattle traffic with the car in the current state that it's in. But then also trying to figure out how to work the who is going to be home at what time situation. We have an older dog, and so she requires quite a bit of attention and caregiving at the moment. And so we don't really want to leave her alone, so we tend to tag team who's at the house so that somebody's around to help her. She has this bad habit of getting stuck in corners, just where she'll go stand in the corner and then she doesn't see very well or hear very well, and then seems to, get lost and then panic, and it creates its own little drama. So that's always interesting. So that created a bit of a hiccup this week. Actually, I think that took care of almost 3 to 4 days this week trying to figure out how to do that and working around that issue. And then I had some late meetings to also work around, so that wasn't helpful. And then on Friday, it was actually a fun event, but it was in a week that was already stressful. It was one more thing, and that was there's an accessibility group up here in Puget Sound that is attended by people who work for different companies here locally. And so it actually is represented by quite a few companies. I won't name them here, but companies that are everyday well-known names you hear of and use their products. And so they have a quarterly meeting where folks can go and learn about some of the best practices or accessibility advances that are being looked into by different companies. So it's always interesting to learn more about some of those practices. I guess I'll call out one of them. Starbucks had hosted one of the meetings a while back, maybe like a year ago. And so they shared some of the innovations they'd been working on. And for them, there's 2 areas where they focus on accessibility. One is the actual mobile app and the computing system. But then the other is the physical layout of the stores. And so they spend a lot of time thinking about how to make the stores as acceptable and comfortable so that people do want to come in and spend some time there. And so I'll give one of the examples is they made a point of lowering where they put the accessible door button when you come into the store, with the intention that it was low enough that folks who are wheelchair users could easily access it, but also with the intention that if you had a service animal, that they could kind of boop it with their nose and open the door. So they spend a lot of time thinking about those things. And so it's always interesting to go listen to what different places and companies are working on. So the one this time was actually at the Seattle Zoo, or the Woodland Park Zoo, to be specific. And so it was very interesting. One example they gave of things that they were working on was they're trying to make sure that during their summer vacation programs that they always have an ASL interpreter present to support the people in the audience. And so they shared that last summer, one of the things they also shared, their preference is when the animals are a type such as you could get away with it, I guess, they have the interpreter get in the actual enclosure with the animal so that people can see them. Because for ASL interpreters, having line of sight's very important. So they shared that they had an event this summer with the penguins, and they had the ASL interpreter get in the enclosure with the penguins. And unfortunately, I guess frustrated or irritated one of the animals, and they ended up getting bit in the process of translating for folks. But another accessibility improvement that they had made was whenever they have benches inside the zoo, they next to it will specifically include a concrete pad, and that's so that if you had a companion who is using a wheelchair, they could sit next to you on the bench and you could be together and sit and rest. So I thought that was a nice one. They mentioned that sometimes they have trouble with people coming and putting the garbage cans in that spot because it looks like a good spot for that. But that not only people in wheelchairs, but they also noticed that it benefited families who have strollers who then can kind of park their stroller out of the way or have their child sit next to them on the bench. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. I guess now that I've just said that, I'm going to bring up another point that I've noticed when I do the editing for this podcast, is that I have a habit of saying it's interesting or that's interesting quite a bit. I was not aware, I guess, until I heard myself speaking that I say it so often. So I'm going to try to catch myself and not do it so much. We'll have to see how this goes. I actually even went to ChatGPT and asked, what are some variations of the phrase "it's interesting" that I could use instead of saying that so much. I think in the heat of the moment that I'll probably forget and use it more than I intended to. I guess I have one more thing to share, and I almost hesitate to share this, but the events of this week have been very frustrating to see because there have been some major news events, and I don't want to name names and talk about people necessarily. But what it has done, it seems to me, folks seem to be trying to demonize people with disabilities, specifically with mental health disabilities. And so that's a very frustrating situation. This whole intention of this podcast was to try to address some of those long stigmas and discriminations that folks with disabilities face. And so to have it kind of rear its head this week was very frustrating. And I hesitate to bring this up because years ago I had listened to this lady who was an autism advocate. And she had started because her child was autistic, and so she'd realized that some of the resources that were out there were not as beneficial for supporting her child. And so she had actively started getting involved at a local level and then a state level, trying to help create legislature that would help support people with disabilities. And I think had been instrumental in getting the ABLE Act passed in her local state. And so it was very interesting to listen to her talk about, how to go about and be politically active to support disabilities. And one of the things that she shared, however, was that if you want to help people with disabilities, then you need to make sure that you are not being political out in the public sphere. That as far as everyone's concerned, you don't have any particular political visions or parties, that you're there to help folks with disabilities and to be very trained on that. And so that's the standpoint that I've taken, is I don't focus on politics, I focus on helping people with disabilities. But again, this week's been very frustrating to hear some pretty horrible things said about people with disabilities, including the idea of euthanizing them. Well, they didn't even say it that politely, they said killing them. Just because they don't understand disabilities or mental health, or folks don't seem to want to invest in how to help people who do have mental health conditions and need support in that way. So I guess just as a quick reminder that if we're living biblical lives and following the example of Christ, that we should pay attention to the things that Christ has said and use that as I guess, a guiding star in how we act. And so I'll just read here from Matthew 25:40. I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. And so it's a good reminder to treat everybody the same way that you would treat Jesus if he were standing here. Because that is essentially what you're doing. You're God's creation, everyone else is God's creation as well. And so they deserve the dignity and respect that comes from being a child of God. So with that lecture, I guess, those words, I guess I'll get started with the content of this episode. So I'm going to be talking about the book of Job today. So the book of Job stands as one of the oldest and most profound works in biblical literature. Likely written between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, Job is a poetic and philosophical text that wrestles with some of humanity's deepest questions. Why do the righteous suffer, and where is God in our pain? Unlike other biblical narratives that follow a straightforward story, Job is written as a dramatic dialogue framed by prose. Its structure, an opening heavenly scene, poetic speeches filled with lament, challenge, and wisdom, and a closing resolution, reveals both its literary artistry and its theological depth. The book has influenced not only Jewish and Christian thought, but also philosophy, literature, and art across the centuries, making it one of the most studied and quoted texts in the entire Bible. The book of Job is one of 3 core books of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible, alongside Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, with Psalms and the Song of Songs often grouped into a broader category as well. Each of these wisdom books wrestles with the question of how to live well in God's world, but they approach it from a different perspective. Proverbs presents wisdom as orderly and reliable. If you live righteously, life will generally go well. It reflects the cause and effect view of wisdom. Do good and you'll prosper. Do evil and you'll suffer. Ecclesiastes challenges that by pointing out life's unpredictability and apparent futility. The vanity of vanities, reminding us that wisdom cannot guarantee control or certainty. Job goes even further by telling the story of an innocent man whose suffering cannot be explained by sin or folly. Job dismantles simplistic connections between righteousness and reward, insisting that wisdom must make space for mystery, suffering, and God's sovereignty beyond human understanding. In this way, Job stands as a counterbalance within wisdom literature. It affirms that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but it refuses to reduce wisdom to neat formulas. Instead, it pushes readers to wrestle with the complexities of suffering, justice, and divine purpose. Together, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job form a conversation on wisdom. Proverbs teaching that righteous living leads to blessing, Ecclesiastes warning that life is often fleeting and uncertain, and Job revealing that suffering can strike the innocent, leaving ultimate wisdom in the mystery of God's sovereignty. So as a basic synopsis of the book of Job opens in heaven, where Satan challenges Job's integrity, claiming that Job only honors God because of his prosperity. God allows Satan to test Job, stripping him of wealth, children, and health, yet Job refuses to curse God. In his suffering, Job sits in ashes and is visited by friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who insist his pain must be punishment for sin. Job protests his innocence, pours out his anguish, and wrestles with the injustice of his condition. A younger man, Elihu, later adds his voice, emphasizing God's greatness and urging Job toward humility. Finally, God speaks from the whirlwind, not giving Job direct answers, but revealing his vast wisdom and power compared to human limitation. Humbled, Job acknowledges his smallness and surrenders to God's sovereignty. In the end, God rebukes Job's friends for misrepresenting him. He restores Job's fortunes and blesses him with even greater abundance than before. I guess I'll take a little side path here to talk about Elihu, which is something that often comes up But there are some folks, I guess specifically biblical scholars, who believe that his speech was added later. And so there's three reasons for that. The first is the flow of the narrative. So Job and his three friends debate, and then Job finishes his defense. Without Elihu, the story could move smoothly into God's appearance in the whirlwind. Elihu seems to interrupt that natural transition. The second reason they believe that it might be a later addition is the style and vocabulary. The language and style of Elihu's speeches differ somewhat from the rest of the book. His introduction is unusually long and formal, which makes it feel like a later insertion. And then third, it's a different perspective. His theology emphasizes God's justice and uses suffering as discipline to teach and refine. That's a nuance that doesn't fully match the earlier dialogues or the direct words of God that follow. That said, not all scholars agree. Some argue that Elihu is an integral part of the book, providing a bridge between Job's protests and God's response, while others see him as a secondary voice added by later editors to balance or soften Job's challenges. At its heart, Job invites us into a cosmic courtroom where suffering is not explained with easy answers, but examined through tension, honesty, and mystery. Job himself becomes a literary archetype, the innocent sufferer whose voice refuses to be silenced, whose cries echo both despair and hope. The dialogues with his friends, the confrontation with God, and the final restoration all highlight the unique blend of poetry and prose that makes this book a masterpiece of ancient wisdom literature. The story of Job also gives us a profound lens for thinking about suffering and disability, not just in terms of physical pain, but also how it touches relationships, emotions, theology, and community. By tracing key moments in Job's journey, we can see how his experience speaks powerfully into the realities of disability today. Let's walk through 7 themes that emerge from the book of Job, each one offering insight into both his story and our own. So the first theme is Job's physical affliction. So I'm going to be reading from Job chapter 2. And again, the basic story is that God and Satan have been talking. Satan basically says that the only reason Job is such a good worshiper of God and such a good human being is that nothing bad has ever happened to him. And so after some thought, then God decides to allow Satan to essentially afflict Job to see how that would impact his faith. So in chapter 1, Job faces his first test, which is essentially losing his family. So then in chapter 2, he faces his second test, which is physical affliction. So I'll be reading from chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, from a section called Job's Second Test. On another day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike its flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So as far as going back to that theme of physical affliction, again, Job is struck with sores from the sole of his feet to the top of his head, and so he sits there among the ashes, scraping his skin with broken pottery. So that's a very vivid image of physical suffering. And so in some ways you can correlate this to the idea of a sudden onset disability, where all of a sudden his body is no longer functioning the way it once did. Most people will know someone in their lifetime who has a disability, and that's because a quarter of all people will at some point in their life develop a disability or be identified as having a disability. So again, it's one of the only groups that you can just at the drop of a hat become a member of. And so again, here is Job. He suddenly has a disability that did not occur before, and his body doesn't function the way it did before. Must in some ways feel a lot like a betrayal of his physical self. And so again, his physical affliction and the sudden onset of suffering changes his body. And this has a correlation to disability again, because this is not an uncommon experience for folks with disabilities. So theme 2 is social and emotional dimensions of disability. Job experiences social stigma related to his disability. People suddenly begin to avoid him. Children mock him, and even his close friends fail to comfort him. His wife even tells him to curse God and die, as we just read, showing how disability can strain relationships. So disability here isn't just physical, it becomes relational, it becomes emotional, and becomes communal. And so the main point of this, again, is that disability and the social stigma that can be attached to it can sometimes result in people experiencing distance from their friend, spouse, and their community as they try to struggle with what it means to have this disability. So I'm going to be reading Job 19. I actually think I'll read the entire chapter. I think it's an interesting one. Again, it's very vivid imagery that's presented throughout the entire book. And this is during the time when he's having the back and forth conversations with his friends who have come to tell him that he must have done something in order to incur the wrath of God. Then Job replied, "How long will you torment me and crush me with words? 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. If it is true that I have gone astray, my error remains my concern alone. If indeed you would exalt yourselves above me and use my humiliation against me, then know that God has wronged me and drawn his net around me. Though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there is no justice. He has blocked my way so I cannot pass. He has shrouded my paths in darkness. He has stripped me of my honor and removed the crown from my head. He tears me down on every side till I am gone. He uproots my hope like a tree. His anger burns against me. He counts me among his enemies. His troops advance in force. They build a siege ramp against me and encamp around my tent. He has alienated my brothers from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My kinsmen have gone away. My friends have forgotten me. My guests and my maidservants count me a stranger. They look upon me as an alien. I summon my servant, but he does not answer, though I beg him with my own mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife. I am loathsome to my own brothers. Even the little boys scorn me. When I appear, they ridicule me. All my intimate friends detest me. Those I love have turned against me. I am nothing but skin and bones. I have escaped with only the skin of my teeth. Have pity on me, my friends, have pity, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you pursue me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh? Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. If you say how we will hound him, since the root of the trouble lies in him, you should fear the sword yourself, for wrath will bring punishment by the sword, and then you will know that there is judgment. So again, the point of this reading, or at least in this particular theme, was to point out the social, emotional dimension of disability and how isolating it can feel and how it can strain relationships and impact how you're treated and kind of stigmatized for having a disability. So a third theme that comes up in the book of Job as it relates specifically to disability is the key theological question of why suffering. Job's friends insist that his suffering must be a punishment for sin. This reflects an ancient and still common stigma that disability or suffering is a sign of divine judgment. The narrative strongly rejects this idea. Job is described as blameless and upright. His suffering is not caused by his sin. So I'll read from Job 1:1 again just to drive that point home. So it starts off, in the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. So despite the fact that his friends keep trying to bring back his affliction as being a judgment from God for having done something wrong, we know Job did not do anything wrong, and so there's not a direct tie between what he's going through and the suffering and a specific sin that he himself had committed. So the key theme of this and the idea of suffering is that his friends have a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of the theology of God and the intention of God in this, and that his disability is not a punishment for sin. The fourth major theme as it relates to disability, or I guess lessons that we can learn from Job related to disability, are Job's lament as a model of honesty. Job openly expresses anguish, despair, and even anger at God. His lament is not condemned by God, showing that people with disabilities or suffering can bring their full, raw emotions to God without fear. This challenges faith communities to create space for honest lament rather than only offering easy answers. So I'm actually going to digress a little bit, and I went and looked up on Google what exactly a lament was. And so it's a form of prayer that honestly expresses sorrow, grief, and pain to God, strengthening a believer's relationship and trust in his character. It provides a biblical and faithful framework for believers to process suffering within the context of their faith, acknowledging the brokenness of the world while holding on to hope in God's ultimate promises. So I guess some of the common patterns you see within a lament are turning to God, bringing the complaint itself, boldly asking for help, and then choosing at the end to trust or praise God. So I'm actually going to be doing 3 readings from Job on this particular idea of Job's lament as a model of honesty. I think they're particularly interesting chapters and passages, and they also, again, speak to being able to bring to God your raw emotions and honestly expressing them. So from Job 3, 1 through 14. This is from a section called Job Speaks. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that it said a boy is born. That day, may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered into any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain, and not see the first rays of dawn. For it did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who built for themselves places now lying in ruins." So then I'll next read from Job 7, and I am going to read the whole chapter. "Does not man have hard service on earth? Are not his days like those of a hired man? Like a slave longing for the evening shadows, or a hired man waiting eagerly for his wages, so I have been allotted months of futility, and nights of misery have been assigned to me. When I lie down, I think, how long before I get up? The night drags on, and I toss till dawn. My body is clothed with worms and scabs. My skin is broken and festering. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and they come to an end without hope. Remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. My eyes will never see happiness again. The eye that now sees me will see me no longer. They will look for me, but I will be no more. As a cloud vanishes and is gone, so he who goes down to the grave does not return. He will never come to his house again. His place will know him no more. Therefore I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the monster of the deep that you put me under guard? When I think my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, even then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me with visions, so that I prefer strangling and death rather than this body of mine. I despise my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone. My days have no meaning. What is man that you make so much of him, that you give him so much attention, that you examine him every morning and test him every moment? Will you never look away from me, or let me alone even for an instant? If I have sinned, what have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my offenses and forgive my sins? For I will soon lie down in the dust. You will search me, but I will be no more. One of the things that I find fascinating about that particular passage is for folks who have had a physical disability and maybe had some sicknesses, when it talks about not finding comfort when you lie down and not having joy or hope, of something being different or better. When you have a disability, sometimes if things are not going well, you can feel a lot of despair. And so I can definitely feel what Job is going through in the words that he uses here and understand the depth of his misery. So then the last chapter I'll be reading from this theme again of Job's lament as a model of honesty is Job 10. I loathe my very life, therefore I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me, but tell me what charges you have against me. Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the schemes of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? Are your days like those of a mortal, or your years like those of a man, that you must search out my faults and probe after my sin, though you know that I am not guilty and that no one can rescue me from your hand? Your hand shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you molded me like clay. Will you now turn me to dust again? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese, clothe me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews? You gave me life and showed me kindness, and in your providence watched over my spirit. But this is what you concealed in your heart, and I know that this was in your mind. If I sinned, you would be watching me and would not let my offense go unpunished. If I am guilty, woe to me. Even if I am innocent, I cannot lift my head, for I am full of shame and drowned in my own affliction. If I hold my head high, you stalk me like a lion, and again display your awesome power against me. You bring new witnesses against me and increase your anger toward me. Your forces come against me wave upon wave. Why then did you bring me out of the womb? I wish I had died before any eye saw me. If only I had never come into being, or had been carried straight from the womb to the grave. Are not my few days almost over? Turn away from me so I can have a moment's joy before I go to the place of no return, to the land of gloom and deep shadow, to the land of deepest night, of deep shadow and disorder, even where the light is like darkness. Again, very, very powerful imagery in this chapter. And one that really sticks out to me is when he said, if I hold my head high, you stalk me like a lion, and again display your awesome power against me. So the idea that God is stalking him like a lion, that even if he had done something wrong, that here he is being preyed upon by God almost. So these are powerful words, and especially when you think about them in the context of speaking to God this way and being angry and talking about you rather had never been born than to have to live with this, that your suffering is so intense and so deep that anything would be better than this particular version of pain you're going through. And again, tying that back to disability, again, people with disabilities often experience, frankly, quite a bit of suffering depending on the nature of the disability, and how in the darkest moments it must feel like you're being preyed upon or that there's no hope for anything different. So again, theme 4 in this lament is that it challenges people of faith to really think honestly and be more open and not offer cheap platitudes, if we're going to be blunt, about disability, and not making passing comments like thoughts and prayers, but really thinking about and understanding the suffering that person's going through and having some compassion for it. So again, it's okay to lament. That's one of the things that we learn from the book of Job, and that lament itself is a faithful prayer. It's okay to bring pain and anger to God. So the 5th theme that we'll be talking about today, as far as the lessons that we can learn about disability from the book of Job, comes from God's response itself. And so God doesn't explain why Job suffers. That's one of the interesting things about this book, is that despite basically a whole conversation, I think it's 42 chapters of this book, there never is an answer given as to why do people suffer. I had, for example, a minister when I was joining our church in Kansas say that he thought that suffering was tied to us living in a fallen world. One of the core tenets of Christianity itself, or one of the pushbacks people sometimes have against God, is why suffering. The book never does quite address that. Despite walking through all these different discussions or philosophical arguments about why suffering, but what we do here then is that God comes and shifts the perspective of that, where essentially, rather than answering Job as to why this is happening to him, he basically tries to show him the vastness and complexity of creation itself. So this reframes disability not as something that must be explained, but as part of a bigger mystery of life and God's purposes. God validates Job's honesty, and then at the end, he also actually rebukes his friends for misrepresenting God himself. So we learn that, this whole time all his friends have been telling him the different things he's been doing that are wrong, or he must have done wrong. And then God basically comes and says, no, you're wrong. And you don't really understand why why I do the things that I do. Job, again, has that opportunity after defending himself so much in the story, lamenting to God so much about his suffering and how it wasn't deserved, and he doesn't understand why it's happening to him. He'd rather be dead than have this happen to him. And then God finally comes and answers him, and so he gets that response. And it's funny, from a disability standpoint, I guess a lot of people would love to be able, actually I hear that question a lot, if I had an opportunity to ask God, fill in the blank, people always talk about what they would ask, or what mystery they'd want to solve. And so here Job he finally gets the response from God, and it's not really the response he was necessarily looking for. What it is in some ways is a reminder of the awesomeness of God, but also the fact that God's ways are higher than our ways, and Job's not going to understand because God doesn't owe him an explanation as to why these things happen. So I'm going to be reading from God's response. So I actually read this in a previous podcast, so I won't read too much of this. God's response actually goes from the beginning of 38 through 41. So I'm going to start at 38 and then skip through different parts of that, just to pick some of the more interesting parts out. So from 38, starting at 1, from a section, the Lord speaks. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the seas behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and opened its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no farther, here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it may take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal, its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gate to the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. I guess I'll skip next to 39, and this chapter actually provides a lot of very descriptive representations or discussions about animals. So I won't read the whole thing, but I'll start here. At 39:13. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, but they cannot compare with the pinions and feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them, that some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labor was in vain, for God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider. Do you give the horse his strength, or clothe his neck with a flowing mane? Do you make him leap like a locust, striking terror with his proud snorting? He paws fiercely, rejoicing in his strength, and charges into the fray. He laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. He does not shy away from the sword. The quiver rattles against his side, along with the flashing spear and lance. In frenzied excitement he eats up the ground. He cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. At the blast of the trumpet he snorts. Aha! He catches the scent of battle from afar. The shout of the commanders and the battle cry. Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build his nest on high? He dwells on a cliff and stays there at night. A rocky crag is his stronghold. From there he seeks out his food. His eyes detect it from afar. His young ones feast on blood, and where the slain are, there is he. So then, starting at 40, the Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's, and can you voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor, and clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Look at every proud man and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. So this goes on a little bit longer. I won't continue to read because you get the idea at this point. But it's very interesting for God to do a roll call of his abilities and accomplishments and the things that he knows and the sight that he has that humans don't have. And for Job, who's been upset and complaining and very focused on his own suffering, to then realize who he's been complaining to and he's not really worthy. Then to continue these complaints is how he kind of comes out of that. Again, though, God does respond to him, not with the answer to the basic question of why suffering, but about God's presence, God's perspective and viewpoint, the higher viewpoint that God has of creation and of the animals, the creatures that inhabit his creation. Again, it's also interesting, too, that God does rebuke his friends for having the audacity to misrepresent him. And so I'll read that part. And this is actually from the epilogue of the story. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Not only did Job complain or lament or bring his anger and emotions to God, that God doesn't punish him, talks to him, again, not with the answers he's looking for, but does provide him context about who God is, but then gets frustrated or gets angry with the friends for speaking incorrectly about God's reasoning for doing things. So the sixth key theme as it relates to disability in the Bible is the idea of restoration and community. So at the very end of the epilogue, it says, "Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is it that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Surely I speak of things I do not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." And so then we come to essentially the end of the story and the epilogue, where we discover that Job's health, wealth, and relationships have been restored. And so it's not just the physical healing that he undergoes, but essentially a restoration of everything that happened before he was tested. So we even learn that his community comes back to comfort him. So from 42:10, after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord made him prosperous again and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought upon him, and each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. And then we learn that the Lord blessed the later part of Job's life more than the first. So I will say that one's always been kind of interesting, because if I were to have lost my children, having new children wouldn't necessarily replace the grief of having lost the first children. But I understand what the story is saying. The idea of restoration emphasizes the returning to Job of what he had had before the testing had started, including his personal dignity. So the idea of restoration itself is something that can really resonate with folks who are suffering, the idea that they eventually will be healed, or they get to a place where they'll feel better and things won't be the way they are now. And so you can also think of how that impacts, or how that could be included in the idea of a disability ministry, where we would highlight inclusion, belonging, and restored community for folks with disabilities, when they're not facing stigma and being pushed to the outer edges, but being actively welcomed in to participate and be one with other members of God's church. Key insight for this section is that restoration and dignity and community and belonging are as important as physical healing. So the final theme from this book that relates to disability is the idea of it having a modern application. So the book of Job challenges the assumption that disability is always tied to sin or personal failure. It encourages empathy, presence, and listening rather than offering platitudes. It elevates lament as a valid spiritual practice for people with disabilities and those who support them. So again, to provide a summary of what we've learned as far as the book of Job, Job is tested not because of something he specifically did, but he is tested. We never understand, or he never receives the answers he's looking for as to why he experienced suffering. That's very often true for folks who have disability or have a situation where they do experience suffering. You don't really get the answers as to why it happened. But by faith in God, is then able to seek healing and peace and eventually restoration and a restoring of his place in the community as he moves forward. So in short, Job's story invites us to move from seeing disability as divine punishment to seeing it as part of the mystery of human life in a broken world, where God's presence and community support matter more than easy answers. So today we learned that the book of Job teaches us that suffering is not always the result of sin, and that the worth of a person is never determined by their circumstances or physical condition. Job's endurance shows that God values honesty in our pain and welcomes our deepest questions. For those living with disability, Job's story offers a profound and powerful reminder. Limitation does not mean lesser value, and struggle does not mean divine rejection. Instead, God's presence meets us in the middle of suffering, affirming that dignity, purpose, and belonging are never lost. Job's journey reminds us that wisdom is not found in simplistic answers, but in a faith that holds fast even when the path feels dark. Job's story reminds us that disability is not a mark of God's judgment, but part of the mystery of life in a world that often feels broken. God doesn't condemn Job for his lament. In fact, God honors his honesty. That tells us something profound. We don't need to hide our pain, our doubts, or our limitations from God. Instead, we are invited to bring them into his presence, trusting that he sees us, hears us, and values us, even when our bodies or our lives don't look the way the world expects. And just as Job's community eventually returned to comfort him, we're called to surround people with disabilities with dignity, support, and belonging. So thank you for joining me today. I'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode, where we'll be exploring the idea of the dark night of the soul. Until then, remember that suffering does not diminish our worth, and weakness does not silence the image of God within us. Like Job, we can face our trials with courage, knowing that God's love remains steadfast through every season of life. Goodbye for now. Paul's Thorn Podcast, Episode 10, copyright 2025 by Angeli Vincent, all rights reserved.